So my title that I gave for this presentation is sort of quite big. It's a bit over-promising, possibly. What I'm going to talk about today is the use of subject pronouns in corpora from 3 Oceanic languages. And I will hopefully be able to make a point how that would relate to a kind of assumed or hypothesized cycle of re-grammaticalizing or getting to a pre-stage of re-grammaticalizing subject-predicate agreement in Oceanic languages. Here's an overview. So basically what I'm going to do today is first give you a bit of an overview of my corpora or my corpus, then present you with a variation, a study of subject expression in Vera, focusing on the choice between pronoun and zero subjects, and then see to compare this to first findings from a corpus of Nafsan and of Teal, and then I draw some conclusions. So the corpus I'm drawing on here is a multilingual corpus called Multicast that I've been working on with Jeffrey Haig and other colleagues at Bamberg University for the last few years. This is a corpus of narrative texts that share a common characteristic that they are all annotated for features that are relevant to questions of referential choice, argument expression, and also do or contain annotations for referent tracking so that we can actually investigate and analyze things like anaphoric relationships and so forth. The corpus is available in various formats. Niels Schieber has done all of that and he'll be acknowledged hereby. For those of you using R, you can also load a multicast R package from your CRAN service and do all this analysis yourself, and it's fully replicable. So you can go there and play around with these things. I've got 11 languages so far. Focus of this map is a bit different from the focus of this conference or of our common interest. The languages that I'm interested in here are here, except of course for Teal, which is a Papuan language from East New Britain, but otherwise Teal, Vera and Nafsan are here. So first of all, I'd like to report on a study, a more classical variation, a study of subject realization in Vera, focusing on the choice between pronoun and zero. So this is one of the corpora from Multicast. This is, of course, like all corpora and Multicast, a subset of the overall corpus, which is much larger. But this is 11 texts, 3,600 clause units, all annotated, as described before. And this is Vera, so spoken also in Vanuatu next to Vireus, nowadays at least, growing population of 500 plus. And the study I'm reporting on here, I have been conducting together with Danielle Bard from the Australian National University. So you can consider those next few minutes as kind of co-authored with Danielle. So this is a study that we're about to resubmit. So I'm going to report on this and then come to a comparison. Now, Vera is, you've just seen examples from Vireus, so Vera is very similar, canonical Oceanic language with strict SVO word order. The crucial part here really in this talk is this relationship between subject and predicate. And you get examples like one, Angsarame ora Vera, where subject precedes the verb complex, functioning as the predicate. And then, as in many Oceanic languages, the first constituent of the verb complex is a marker of tense, aspect, mood, and polarity, and it occurs in linear order, then adjacent to the subject expression, which is of some significance for what we are going to do here. So, an angsara is a lexical noun phrase on full expression, and what we are going to focus on today is actually the choice between a pronoun and a zero subject, which would occur in the same position. So you get examples like tu, dimukurma man usuwo, nice example here with a reduplicated mama. But you can also get a zero subject, mevan kil lin vuno, where the subject's given in context and then you can just leave it out. So the question then here is what determines the choice between these two possibilities. Yep. something that we need to know about Vera R, and that's quite significant for this choice, is the morphology of these tense aspect mood polarity markers. So in 12 or 15 of these categories, the exponent is actually something that you could call a particle, meaning a small grammatical word that qualifies also as a small sort of phonological word. Yeah? So it has CV syllable structure. So this is what we get here. It's a future marker, me, and that's one class of forms. Now, interestingly, Vera R has got TAMP markers that are clitics. And the interesting thing, so this is the perfect marker here, so Nimkaluma in 4. And the interesting thing about these clitics is that they are always encliticized to whatever occurs to the left. You can see that from them being phonologically conditioned by the phonological environment to the left. So basically, cliticization here sort of hops over the phrase structure border, so to say, and we get something that Bickel and Nichols call detached clitics, or Himmelmann calls ditopic clitics. And whenever there is, or we can still get 0 subjects with these clitic TAMP markers, and then the clitic would just form a phonological word with whatever precedes it. That might even be a constituent in the preceding clause, as is the case in 5, where the preceding clause is something like he went and then drank kava, so vanim, wana. So the phonological word here would be vanim. Now you could say this is maybe not sort of ideal, but you know, it happens. The other important point about TAMP morphology in Vera R is that in one category that Alex has labeled aorist, and I've kind of settled on labeling prospective because the function is a bit narrower, I think. But the crucial point here is that this paradigm of TAMP markers also preserves some subject agreement properties. In this case here, I'm just showing you difference in number. So for singular subjects, we get a particle form ne. So we get dine frie. In 6 or in 7, so soon it will break. And in the plural or non-singular form of this particle, we again get one of those detached clitics, which are inherently encliticizing to whatever occurs to the left. So we get examples like 8, direct vus keln der sir, and then again in 9, this clitic could attach to even the last constituent of the preceding clause. So van mag sing lik. Yeah, so come and set more, fire more to whatever stuff. And these are the forms that we get, and they are of some significance to the way you express subjects, because you would have certain preferences there. And I tried to, I mean, maybe just eyeball over this, but you can kind of capture these sort of preferences if you think of, you want a clitic to have ideally kind of a fixed host, or at least, you know, to be kind of predictable, sort of better for processing. And you want the number and person of the subject expressed, but maybe expressed ideally only once in a clause, so avoid doubling. So at least sort of prima facie you could establish such preference rules. One thing that's important to note is that that both the prospective and the perfect aspects here account together for roughly 90% of all clauses in the corpus. So there is many more categories, but they are of course very rarely used. I mean, you can sort of imagine that. So this is basically what we're looking at here, and and then, as I said, the prospective marker would also entail subject agreement, and we can hypothesize here something like a complementarity relationship, where we say we either get a free pronoun and then no agreement on the predicate, or we get just the agreement marker on the predicate and then no pronoun on clause level. Looking at clitics, we could expect there to be kind of a tendency for sort of joint processing. So units that occur frequently together and sort of form morphophonological units might then trigger a kind of reuse of that same combination of two forms. This is what, for instance, Bybee and all her work, and then Bybee and Thompson, for instance, in 2007 hypothesized. So this is sort of the basic picture. And we conducted as I said, kind of a classic variationist study. So we looked at the 11 narratives, various speakers, and basically, to cut it a bit short, of the bit more than 3,000 verbal clauses in this corpus, we selected 1,404 that were all finite and that were all third person. And we focus only on non-lexical expressions, as I said before, so pronoun versus zero. And basically, this is sort of the rough frequency. So I included here the noun phrases and the left dislocated constructions just to give you an impression. And I'm just going to say here that left dislocation, so this detachment of a noun phrase followed by a pronominal copy, is really super rare. So this is probably not a driving force of having lots of pronouns in this language. We can come back to that later. But basically, the interesting point here is that pronouns are by far the most frequent non-lexical expression in Vera. So they seem to be becoming overused, so to say, if you will, despite the possibility to leave them zero. So that leads to kind of two questions. One is what drives the choice between the two forms, and the other one is why are pronouns so much more frequent. So in our model, so we have our dependent variable, as I said, and then the independent variables, so the ones that are meant to drive the choice, are here, as I said, the agreement in tense aspect mood, the form class, and then, and I cut this very short here, and then the whole range of factors that you typically include in such a study. So animacy number effects, and then anything that has to do with anaphoric relationships, anaphoric distance, and function, so antecedent function, antecedent form, priming, but then also things like temporal sequencing, the occurrence of connectives or conjunctions and clauses and so forth. All of these might play a role. And basically, and again, unfortunately, I have to be very short here, but basically almost all these things contribute significantly to the variation. In this model here, you also see some factors that are actually significant, but they sort of go in the completely wrong direction that don't really yield a story. So for temporal sequencing, for instance, we have a preference for overall for pronominal subjects. But then if we look at a specific context where we have same subjects chains in temporal sequencing, then we find a preference for zero subjects. And then also down here we see that if there is no inflection in the tense aspect, mood morphology, then there's a preference for pronouns. If the tum marker is a particle, there's more zeros, and this is here the bit, if the tum marker is not that third singular ne, then there is generally a preference for pronouns. So to cut this story a little bit short, and you can sort of read up the details here, how that all plays up. But I think the sort of message or the story that we get here is that overall there is a massively strong effect of antecedent distance in that subjects are more likely to be pronouns if the antecedent is 2 or more clauses away. So we have what I call here immediate same subject. So this is the ISS is like subject was in the preceding clause, and you sort of chain them up. And then the other one is anything else, so to say. And you can see that pronouns are, or that generally we have overall a default option of using subject pronouns with only sort of a last stronghold, so to say, of zero subjects in this one environment, mainly at least as a strong tendency. And interestingly, in 226 of these 332 cases of zeros here in the same subject context, they also have the third singular prospective particle ne. So it is really, although this is, you get different kinds of combinations, but this is really statistically the strongest, or the niche, so to say, where we get zero subjects. Overall, all non-lexical subjects tend to be pronouns. So we get even chains like this here. So mbedim kaludim un binanara. So repetition here of pronouns. Or in 11 direct mulkal direct bebirin oren vavangam do. This is sort of still expected because we have clitic tam markers here. But then, and then we get some of these zeros in context like 12, Rusuwo ne karakane role nanara lumasar, ne ro lumasar keke ne sar I. Yeah, so a chain of zero subjects, but then the ne marker here. But we still, and this is something that we don't really have a good explanation for, so to say, we still also get kind of chains of subject pronouns where we do get the prospective third singular marker. So dine mi irsuwo, dine bur bur. But then mene van ma, ne tik min diso. There might be an influence of animacy here as well, which also showed sort of slight significance in our model. But we can't really explain why we would get that first chain of examples. Overall, or what I think is sort of interesting here is that we might be able to sort of hypothesize that we really, so we're not finding any ongoing language change. That doesn't seem to be any difference across speakers. So speakers behave very homogeneously. There's also no differences across age groups or so. But it seems that when we consider what I guess we know or assume about proto-languages of Vera are, that the pronoun use might have been much lower previously. So if we think of what are those enclitics today, we know that they had syllabic form. So used to be something like plus some vowel, me, ma, whatever. And also we know from Alex's work also that we used to have something like subject indexing throughout clauses in proto-languages, and then that was reduced to just one category, so we get it in only 50% of all clauses. Yeah? And then also that one of those exponents was possibly ka or whatever, lost its vowel and became a clitic. So if we take all of that into account, and we think that the factors that we had identified were also, of course, at play basically previously, then we could say that at some point there has been a development towards a kind of pronoun or non-zero, non-null subject language, so to say, I would say. Now very briefly, because I'd be running out of time, to get a bit of an impression from other Oceanic languages. So I said we also have a corpus of Nafsan, a bit more than 1,000 clauses. And in Nafsan, we get a slightly different picture. So we have zero subjects throughout. There's a little bit of differences. But even in non-same subject chains, so to say, we still get zero subjects all the time. Well, when I say zero subjects, I mean here zero subjects on clause level. You might know that, so Nafsan is one of those other quite typical Oceanic languages where we actually do have the subject indexing fused with TAM marking as part of or in the first slot of the predicate, so that we get those zero subjects. So this can describe it as a classic kind of head marking pro-drop language, Jägerli, Saphir style, so to say. So we don't get those pronouns, and where we do get them, they'd be pragmatically marked, and you get kind of a doubling context, so to say, of pronoun and clitic. So you could also say, so you could also read this here as something like there's proclitics or clitics everywhere, and there is some doubling context, so to say. Yeah, it's basically the same thing. Now, very briefly, I'm looking at Teal, which is a bit of a much more difficult to look at because it's a much more complicated language in many ways. So it's 4 texts annotated by Ulrike Mosel. And in Teal, we get this picture here, which I think is quite unusual. Also, when you look into the variationist literature on subject expression, so that really this contrast between same subject, one clause distance versus anything else doesn't seem to yield any or isn't significant. So you get exactly the same proportions here of pronoun and zero. Well, I mean, I'd be a little bit over time, I guess, but something that is interesting about Teal is that it also preserves something like subject agreement in an imperfective marker that is occurs at the end of the verb complex. So forms like nana and ri, and you can kind of see immediately that they are also retentions probably of proto-languages. So we get the same contrast here, pronouns versus 0, and then we get a thumb marker in first position. And then we have this imperfective marker there. The problem, or the interesting thing about TEOP is that it also has variable word orders. It's basically a verb second language, and you can have different arguments in different positions. Then this is what you see in these two examples here with 0 subjects. Just so this is TEOP has been a bit of a problem to analyze, but just very briefly, I give you just some impressionistic sort of graphs. So we get something like a slight, but only slightly significant animacy effect here, so that I mean, pronouns are just you know, evenly distributed among human referents, but with non-humans there is a dispreference for pronouns. There seems to, or there's a significant, at least when you do, you know, simple chi-square test kind of thing with this data, there seems to be a significant distribution of pronouns versus 0 in terms of singular versus plural number. And then there are significant effect of presence of agreement in imperfective, and also of presence of the conjunction mais. The conjunction mais actually prefers 0 subjects, and there seems to be kind of a combination mais par, and then they did something or so that is becoming a kind of fossilized form or so. Anyway, so basically it seems like for TEOP, we don't seem to get, at least not a very clear picture of what's going on here. And also we don't seem to have very clear sort of structural context where we could say, okay, this could be something that would, you know, lead to an increased use of pronouns when we compare that to what I said about Vera R. So conclusions in Vera R, we find, you know, generally effects that are very well known for the choice between pronoun and 0, but then also in the end, the very significant factors are on the one hand the same subject context, on the other hand the presence or the morphology of tense aspect mood, and also the presence of agreement. An important point though was that even where agreement is present, and even where we have a same subject chain, there is still a preference for pronouns. So still 70% of these cases are still pronouns. So we would see 0 in Vera R as a kind of, well, if we think that there's been a development towards a non-null subject language, then that's kind of a last stronghold of 0 subjects, it seems. And I think this warrants a hypothesis that we see some stage of where Vera R is kind of, could be seen as regrammaticalizing subject indexing, although we don't, you know, we can't foresee or observe any sort of movement, so to say, towards that. And if we, I mean, if we compare it to Nafsan, we could say, okay, Nafsan is completely there, so to say. It's done that redevelopment or retained some of the forms and done or undergone all sorts of development, so that we do have regular subject indexing in the language, and then we get what we find only partially in Vera R, namely that we get subject categories expressed only once, namely in these proclitics, and we don't get any doubling. In TEOP, this is very tentative still and very initial, as you will have noticed or noted. But I think one thing that may have an effect, or that may play a role in TEOP, is, as I said, that we don't get this very clear structural context that we saw for Vera R would trigger something like an overuse of pronouns over zeros. What I would like to do in the future is look, well, I mean, do the TEOP more properly, so to say. That's been a bit of a problem with the scripts that we've been running and getting the data out properly. But so that's why you know, gave you these initial observations, and then also include or see what's happening with left dislocations and lexical noun phrases, and then also see what's happening with in comparison to neighboring languages. I can tell you a little bit about Lemery, which is kind of quite similar. No, I'm not going to do it now. I'm 2 minutes over time, 2.5. But anyway, and just very briefly, so So what I was gonna say then is, of the takeaway message here is that if there's anything like an instant or an instigation of this process of subject indexing agreement, then it would require some very specific structural environment, I would say, that allows for sort of crystallization, so to say, of subject pronouns, and it's probably not very well attributed to the functional factors that, for instance, Givon with his topicalization hypothesis, or Mira Ariel with her accessibility theory tries to propagate. Also because you can't really see how that changed. How do people suddenly get the idea to do more topicalizations or so? I don't quite see how that would happen. Anyway, so with a bit over time, hopefully not too long. Oh yeah, it says the end. Thanks very much. Vera. I'll leave you with, you can read Jeff's thing here. You like? Okay,
merci beaucoup. Du coup, s'il y a peut-être juste une question avant qu'on puisse tous aller manger.
Don't say that. There's Miriam there.
I do have a question. So you've got a really interesting, one of the things that jumps out for me is the split you've got in Vera, where you have categorical use of pronouns in first and second person, and only variability in the third person.
Yep.
That's exactly, of course, what I found when I've been looking at Bislama, and well, not exactly. It's the same trend. It's an typologically unusual split pro-drop system. It's supposed to be dispreferred, right? And Marilise Baptista has observed it also for Cape Verdean Creole and all varieties of it. And we've also got attestations of it for Franco-Provençal varieties. And so there was a sort of little cluster of us that have been thinking that maybe this is this typologically unusual split pronoun system, pro-drop system, as a function of being a contact language. That's obviously not going to be the story for you guys with Vera. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about why it is that you have such an unusual split pro-drop system.
Yeah, so I'm actually not so sure how unusual this is. If you look at, so people like, saying, for instance, Eric Fusser, so working on the rise and fall of agreement, these people often see first and second person as the pioneering roles in this development. So they find it in other languages as well, and also when we look into morphological paradigms, we often find that the third persons are zero, and you could kind of say, okay, that's because they haven't grammaticalized yet, at least in some instances. So Ilya Sergeant, for instance, has done some work in this area. So I'm not so sure. The other thing is when you look into, one of the people who's advocated the role of first and second persons in this discourse structure frame context, so to say, is Mira Ariel, who also proposes that first and second persons are the ones that should do that grammaticalization process first because of high accessibility, but in her framework that seems to be self-contradictory, because for her the most accessible form should be zero, right? Exactly as you were saying. So I think it's a little bit unclear, so to say, but I'm not so sure. Maybe we just need more corpus data across languages. But I think we also do find it, I mean, Teal is the same thing, actually. So Teal has categorical first and second persons, both in subject and objects, and we also find it in other languages from other areas.